Theme 8: Peasants, Jamindars, and the State, Agrarian Society and the Mughal Empire, circa 16th 17th centuries. During the 16th and 17th centuries, about 85% of the population of India lived in its villages. Both peasants and landed elites were involved in agricultural production and claimed rights to a share of the produce. This created relationships of cooperation, competition, and conflict among them. The sum of these agrarian relationships made up rural society. Peasants and agricultural production. The basic unit of agricultural society was the village, inhabited by peasants who performed the manifold seasonal tasks that made up agricultural production throughout the year: tilling the soil, sowing seeds, harvesting the crop when it was ripe. But rural India was not characterized by settled peasant production alone. Several kinds of areas, such as large tracts of dry land or hilly regions, were not cultivable in the same way as the more fertile expanses of land. Looking for sources, one of the most important chronicles was the Aine Akbari, authored by Akbar's court historian Abul Fazl, and they have used this N in short for Aine Akbari. So the central purpose of the N was to present a vision of Akbar's empire where social harmony was provided by a strong ruling class. So any revolt or assertion of autonomous power against the Mughal state was, in the eyes of the author of the N, predestined to fail. In other words, whatever we learn from the N about peasants remains a view from the top. Okay. Now, the extensive records of the East India Company provide us with useful descriptions of agrarian relations in eastern India. Peasants and their lands. A peasant was Rayat, plural Riaya or Muzariyan. In addition, we also encounter the terms Kisan or Asami. Sources of the 17th century refer to two kinds of peasants, Khud Kasta and Pahi Kasta. The former, the Khud Kasta, were residents of the village in which they held their lands, and the latter, the Pahi Kasta, were non resident cultivators who belonged to some other village but cultivated lands elsewhere on a contractual basis. And the cultivating peasants, Assamese, in Bengal or other, have 5 acres was the upper limit of an average peasant farm, and 10 acres would make one a rich Assami. Irrigation and technology, the abundance of land, available labor, and the mobility of peasants were three factors that accounted for the constant expansion of agriculture. Areas which received 40 inches or more of rainfall a year were generally rice producing zones, followed by wheat and millets corresponding to a descending scale of precipitation. Irrigation trees and fields, an excerpt from Babarnama, a reconstructed Persian wheel described here. Irrigation projects received state support as well, also repaired old ones like the Saha Nehar in the Punjab during Shah Jahan's reign, and an iron tip or coulter. So, though agriculture was labor intensive, peasants did use technologies that often harnessed cattle energy. One example was the wooden plow, which was light and easily assembled with an iron tip. The spread of tobacco. Akbar and his nobles came across tobacco for the first time in 1604. At this time, smoking tobacco in hookahs or chillums seems to have caught on in a big way. Jahangir was so concerned about its addiction that he banned it. An abundance of crops. So, agricultural cycles, the Kharif autumn and the Rabi spring, and a minimum of two crops a year, do fasla. Mughal provinces of Agra produced 39 varieties of crops, and Delhi produced 43 over 2 seasons, and Bengal produced 50 varieties of rice alone. We are told in the end. And the term Jinse Kamil literally means perfect crops in our sources. And the Mughal state also encouraged peasants to cultivate such crops as they brought in more revenue. And crops such as cotton and sugarcane were Jinse Kamil par excellence. Agricultural prosperity and population growth. Agricultural prosperity and population growth. India's population increased, according to calculations by economic historians, by about 50 million people between 1600 and 1800, which is an increase of about 33% over 200 years. And maize, makkah, for example, was introduced into India via Africa and Spain, and by the 17th century, it was being listed as one of the major crops of Western India. Vegetables like tomatoes, potatoes, and chilies were introduced from the New World at this time, as were fruits like the pineapple and the papaya.